The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we are beginning the new year with the same debates as we had last year, and it all revolves around debt and loans and whether China is a predatory lender in all of this. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that there's all the discussion about the massive amounts of loans that are going on, but very few people actually know about the inner workings of how these loans come about. Most of the time, in fact, probably all of the time, there's an extensive negotiation in all this. And this is what's so interesting, Cobus, because the discussion on the part of, I think, Africans and certainly Westerners is all that this is being done to Africa. China is preying on Africa. China is, entrapping people with these massive amounts of loans. And I think the problem with that narrative is that it, again, strips Africans of their agency. That is their role in all of this. You and I have talked at length about how this might actually be a cold, calculated, strategic, rational decision to take on these loans to build this infrastructure as a way to jumpstart economic development. Now, the key question is, maybe it is a cold, calculated, rational decision, but are they negotiating the best deal? And that's the topic we're going to talk about this evening.
The issue is frequently what is actually happening within the African side of this negotiation. Like, what are the dynamics on the African negotiating side that keep Africans from getting the kind of deals that they should? And sometimes that has to do with Chinese power and the power gap between China and Africa. But there are also other dynamics involved within African governments that make it hard for Africans to get really good deals out of China. And so it's really important to look at the internal dynamics on the African side to see what can be improved.
I think that's really important because oftentimes the deals are much more complex than people think they are. So they'll see a shoddy road, or they'll see a dam or a hospital or the ghost towns in Angola, for example, and people think, why did they build them there? And I had a conversation a couple years ago with a Chinese contractor from a state-owned enterprise. And he said, so often it's the host country that will drive the deal. They will say, when the construction starts, they will say, oftentimes, here's what the budget is. They will drive so much of it. And the contractors show up and do what's being determined by the host countries. Now, again, each of these deals is different. They're very, very complicated. So what we wanted to do was to try and better understand how the negotiations work, what is the inside operating of this, and talk to people who really understand this rather than the speculation that we all too commonly see in the media. So there is no better person out there than Folashadé Soulé, who is a senior research associate at the University of Oxford at the Global Economic Governance program there. She researches negotiation practices of Francophone African governments and their dealings with China. Folashadé has also advised the OECD, that's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the French Development Agency, Agence France Développement, the presidency of Benin, and a variety of consulting firms, including Oxford Analytica, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte. So I think Cobus, there is no better person who is well-versed on the inside negotiations than Folashadé. Folashadé, thank you so much for joining us from London.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's really a pleasure. Now, you wrote an article in early January that got a lot of attention. How to negotiate infrastructure deals with China, 4 things African governments need to get right. And you started your article in a very interesting way, and it implied that China has all the leverage. This idea that, and I, to be honest with you, I assume this as well. So picture you are Benin, Togo, Ghana, these tiny little specks of countries relative to the giant that is China. And the negotiator kind of runs a rough deal and says, if you don't do this and this and this and this, the Chinese then say, you know what? Forget it. We're going to pack up and we're going to go somewhere else. Now, that's how you started your article. And I thought that was so interesting. So before we get into the 4 things that African governments need to get right, can you talk to us a little bit about that dynamic that you described at the top of your article and the leverage and who has leverage actually?
Well, it all started, let's say, the first interview that I got from a senior high-level official, and I asked him just, from the start, how do you negotiate with China? And what he said is, you don't negotiate with China. Well, still, I wasn't really satisfied by that, with that answer. I wanted, to know more about the different dynamics, who negotiates, what are the different, let's say, the different power plays within the negotiation process. It is true that we are living in a context, especially in the African context, where hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, are regarded by many of these African governments as a key vector for economic development. And China, as a single country, remains one of the leading providers of infrastructure development finance to Africa. But when you go further, everything happens in the pre-negotiation process. And there is where the different power dynamics take place. But what I wanted to show in this article is that it is still possible, despite the asymmetric aspect of the negotiation process, it is still possible for African governments to get better deals.
In your article, you make the point, you actually end off the article with saying that no deal is frequently better than a bad deal. And as you said, there seems to be a perception among certain African governments that essentially, imposing conditions or driving a harder bargain means that China will simply withdraw the offer and simply pack up their money and leave. To which extent do you think that fear that you shouldn't demand anything from China because they might simply take the money and withdraw the offer? To which extent do you think that shapes African negotiations with China?
Well, I think that's a fear that's mostly present on the African side. Well, there are several things. Many of these African governments, they have put in their national development plan that infrastructure is, or let's say that they will provide infrastructure to their different populations in different parts of the country. And with China coming with these turnkey projects, to them, somehow it's as if they, from the start, are willing to accept all of the different criteria, all of the different conditions of the loans. But what I noticed even within sometimes one African country, you have some ministries that get better deals than others. And what I mean by better deals is that some of the criteria that are often a source of content, meaning labor rights, respect of norms, environment, construction norms, hiring of local workers, and several of all these conditions. Why is it that in the same country, one minister gets a better deal than the other? So that was a bit the enigma that was guiding my research from the start. And in terms of answers, I notice very often that a good deal is not necessarily something that depends on China. It also depends on how the African government negotiates, but how the negotiation is structured. And that's why I came up with these 4 conditions that are actually the 4 problems that I identified. We could go in detail.
We're going to get. I want to get to the 4 conditions, so I will. That's my next question. But first, I want you to name names here. Okay, I mean, I'm not going to let you off the hook here because you wrote in your article. You said when you look closely at what happens on the ground, some African countries are much better at negotiating with the Chinese than others. Okay? That's a great statement, but it leaves me lacking. So I would like you to identify which countries are doing well and why, and which countries are not doing well and why.
Well, I will give you some examples because it's still an ongoing research. But if you take the example of Benin, small country, but very strategically located next to Nigeria. And that is of strategic importance to China also because of the harbor, because of the location, and the fact that through Benin, you get access to the landlocked countries in West Africa. A road project, an interdepartmental road project that is, one of these strategic projects was, many of the criteria that I mentioned were not sufficiently, how do I say that? They were not sufficiently addressed, meaning that there was a lack of respect of environmental norms. Also, there were several construction norms that were not respected. There were also, in terms of labor rights, many workers on that field did not get, safety, but also, social security or good salaries. So that was an example of let's say, I won't say a bad project, but something that was not in the advantage of the country. On the other hand, the Ministry of Public Works negotiates also a deal with a Chinese state-owned enterprise, because in the first case it was also a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and they succeed in the negotiation process that took much longer, and we will get into details later on when I will talk about the 4 conditions, but where all these same criteria were much better addressed and there were no issues, there were no complaints. So that's an example of what happens within one single country. But one of the examples, and that's I mentioned that in my article, is the example of the railway. The railway project in Kenya and the one in Ethiopia. The one from Ethiopia was much more, let's say, much more modern, but also at the same time less expensive than the one from Kenya. And so that triggers, this question: what happened there? Okay, those are 2 different countries, 2 different characteristics in terms of environment, in terms of technical details. That's true. But why is there such a difference, in terms of cost? Well, many issues also happen there. The negotiation process, the coordination, but also, several allegations of corruption. So those are well, 2 or 3 examples that I can provide for the moment. Just to answer that question. And I can also provide more later on during the conversation.
So in the article, you essentially break down these complications of negotiating with China into 4 strategies. So you call these involve everyone. Then empower the negotiators, keep the public on side, and increase knowledge. I wonder if you can talk us briefly through what you mean with these 4 strategies.
Well, these 4 conditions are of key importance in the negotiation process because most of them, especially the 2 first ones, the first one about involving everyone and the second one about empowering the negotiators, these 2 conditions happen in the pre-negotiation process. And, every negotiation expert will tell you that it's in the pre-negotiation phase that everything should be set on the table and everything should be negotiated in details. And that's the case.
Can I interrupt you very quickly? For those of us who are not familiar what the difference is between the negotiation process and the pre-negotiation process, can you explain the difference between those 2?
Well, let's say that what I call pre-negotiation is when there's first what you said in the early beginnings about this demand-driven aspect. When the first interactions from that part, the first interactions between the Chinese state-owned enterprise, the ambassador, and the African government, the ministerial representatives, the presidency representatives, sometimes experts and lawyers that are, that are also part of the process. There are several steps in the negotiation phase. The core, let's say, before the deal gets signed, that's at the very end between, often the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the ambassador and the representative of the Chinese Policy Bank. But the details of the project, the characteristics, and the different conditions that I mentioned earlier, those happen in the very early beginnings. That's what I meant by the pre-negotiation phase. And in this pre-negotiation phase, it's very important that these governments say what they want. It's that's so key in the process. And what happens, and that brings me to my condition 1, is that very often there are this part is fragmented, meaning that following all these pledges made at the bilateral and multilateral meetings, when these Chinese representatives come to discuss with the technical ministries, sometimes, which should not necessarily be the case. Actually, there are two ways of doing what I noticed. There are two trends. Either everything is centralized. In Togo and Cameroon, for instance, everything is centralized at the presidency and the prime minister cabinet. The Chinese negotiate directly with these officials. In other countries like Senegal, Benin, there are some interaction between the presidency and the prime minister, but then there's a decentralization process that brings the negotiation phase directly to the technical ministries. And they are the ones then dealing with China before going back up, to the prime minister and the presidency. And what happens in these negotiation process is that in many cases, some ministries get circumvented. Let me give you some clear examples. Again, in the case of Benin, which was the very first case study that I did, what happens in Benin is that instead of the different technical ministries coordinating with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, they prefer to deal directly with China, sign the deal, or bring it directly to the upper level, saying, well, it's negotiated, we can go on. And many aspects are not integrated in the contract. First, they don't speak the same language. So there are many communication and language issues where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could have helped. Secondly, some of the technical details are not necessarily, all present. And that will bring me to my second condition, about empowering the negotiators. But this first condition is what happens the most, this fragmented negotiation process where there's a lack of coordination among the different entities within the African government. That creates also several issues. I can now go to the second one, and I'll be quite brief on that one. It's, the presidential intervention. It's important to empower the negotiators. What I noticed often is that the president can intervene in the negotiation process, making the civil servants, let's say, fasten up the project. I don't know if that's how I should put it, but for political reasons, everything should go as fast as possible. The road should be constructed, the bridge should be constructed, because this government, especially in democratic countries where there's only a 5 year term, renewable maybe once, China And China infrastructure becomes very strategic for these governments in order to be able to showcase, what they have been doing. And so some presidents will intervene directly in the negotiation process to fasten everything up and to speed it up. And that also creates several issues because many of the norms are not necessarily respected. I wanted to give you one example, that talks a bit to these two first conditions. The problem with decentralization. A project that I'm currently investigating with a colleague of mine is a sugarcane investment project in Ségou, in the region of Mali. And the contract is only 3 pages long. So any negotiator or lawyer or contract expert will tell you that this is a problem. It suggests a lack of attention to details. And when the contract is signed, it's very difficult for the local officials to try to exert some pressure, for payment of taxes, irrigation water fees, because the company gets the Chinese embassy to pressure the central government and says, well, the deal has been signed, which is very difficult then it's very difficult to renegotiate, and it's a way of telling the local officials just to back off.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
You raise such interesting kind of questions around the dynamics within African governments around this, especially the kind of undercutting of the authority of the negotiators by people above them. How would you suggest that would be solved? It seemed, from the outside, it seemed to me that it's driven a lot by local political imperatives, and then it's also to a certain extent driven even by interpersonal, interactions between them. Kind of where the power differential between different people in the government is so stark. What would you suggest to an African negotiating team going into negotiations with Chinese counterparts to try and avoid these issues that sometimes seem to be inherent to governing itself?
Yes, That actually was my main point also, or one of the key points in my article. The problems, negotiation problems or bad deals are inherent to African governments as well. And the problem is that the president, in some cases, that was the case in Benin, but also sometimes in countries like Togo, they put their ministers, who are often politically appointed ministers, in competition. To get contracts. Everyone is in charge of getting finance for development. And so it's about who gets the deal the quickest way possible. And all of that creates all these issues, of bad deals coming out. What I would suggest is it's very important, and I said that in my article, to involve everyone and just to take time. It's just taking time, not go hastily around the whole negotiation process and about who should get what should be negotiated. Take time and involve everyone. On one single project, there are so many different aspects. So it's important to have this multidisciplinary approach, I would say, of coming from an academic background, but bringing in the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of the Ministry of Environment. And that is what happened before. Let's say before before China became such an important partner for infrastructure funding, with the former development providers, the negotiation process was much more, I won't say slow, but all the different aspects were discussed among all these partners, but also in a more coherent way.
But let me challenge you a little bit on this, because it does sound a little bit like in the ideal, sure, you want to bring everybody involved. That makes sense. We've talked about bringing in civil society groups. You're talking about bringing in other ministries. But that is in a well-functioning government. There's a lot of governments in Africa where the various ministries are actually competing with each other. They're hostile to one another. By involving more ministries, you are also opening up for more corruption. Sure, you want the Minister of Justice to be involved? You're going to have to pay. You want the Minister of Environment to get involved? You're going to have to pay. And then they'll slow it up until they get what they want. So the Chinese have always preferred to deal with a small number of people because that allowed them to get the deals done faster. Now, at the same time, you've said we should open it up, involve everyone. Again, in principle, I agree with you. In practice, I think that's very difficult. But you also said in the program that in democratic countries, politicians are on an electoral timeline. I remember when I was in Kinshasa about 10 years ago, and Joseph Kabila, the president there back then, former president now, I think, he was getting the Chinese to build his 5 chantiers, which were these 5 construction projects, but they were pressured to do it in time for the elections. Didn't matter on the quality, didn't matter on anything. Just get these things done before the election so he could run on, as you said, look at what I've done for you. And so those seem to be at odds with one another. So on the one hand, the timeline gets expedited for political reasons. And on the other hand, you're saying involve more factions, more entities, more discussion, and that could just bog the process down in internal politics. How do you reconcile those two?
Well, there are two things here. First, the responsibility does not only lie upon the African government. It also lies within the Chinese negotiation actors and the different institutions that are involved in the process. So when the Chinese go directly to the technical ministries to get the deals and then try to get the signature of the ministers and all above, they are also making a mistake by not following the official guidelines of the countries, because within these countries, especially the ones that I've studied, whether it's Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Benin, Mali, and also Côte d'Ivoire, there are guidelines for negotiations. There are different rules of negotiation that normally all the development providers should follow. So it's important that the Chinese responsibility is also taken into account here. Secondly, the project, you were talking about the electoral obligation, and I wanted also to come back to what I said earlier about democratic governments and, obligations towards their population. But also in autocratic governments, you take the example of Togo. For Gnassingbé Yadema, he has also some, let's say, responsibilities towards his population, and the population, they hold the government accountable, for providing, social, better social conditions, better economic conditions, and China becomes then a way for the government to legitimize their actions, but also to respond to these different demands. The point is, there are many Chinese projects, and it's interesting. It's those who we almost never hear about, but there are several projects which follow these official guidelines of involving all the different counterparts and all. And there are many examples of successes. I was talking about several ministerial buildings in Benin, led by the Minister of Public Works. They have followed these different guidelines. They have, been able to respect all these different criteria, and the outcome has been positive for the African government. So I would insist on that. I think it's important to bring all these different actors together, and to go beyond the different interpersonal, power plays. That is something that should be, addressed and avoided in the negotiation project.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of corruption in all of this. There's such a strong perception that corruption is endemic in Africa and that it would play into these negotiations. But has that been your experience too? And what role does it actually play in these negotiations?
Well, corruption, there's several allegations of corruption. And corruption happens when the negotiation process is also fragmented. Going directly to the technical ministries opens the way for corruption. What happens clearly is that the Chinese state-owned enterprise or the representative would say, well, if we get this project, if we are allowed to build this priority project of yours, well, you will get 5% or 6%. So there's where corruption also happens. Corruption happens also at the higher level, what I mean by the higher level is the prime minister cabinet, the presidential cabinet. So I think, on the contrary of what you said earlier, Eric, it's when the negotiations are fragmented that corruption possibilities are higher. It's much more difficult to corrupt a whole, let's say, set of negotiators with representatives from all these different countries who are collectively bargaining a deal. So I think, fragmented negotiation is, a vector for an increased level of corruption.
So one of the things that bothers people the most about the Chinese presence in Africa, and it's been something from almost the beginning, is the presence of Chinese workers when they see them at construction sites. I mean, it just sticks in them. I mean, Michael Sata, the former president of Zambia, said, he doesn't want to see a Chinese pushing a wheelbarrow. That was his famous kind of saying. And it really defines so much of the narrative today about the Chinese presence in Africa, something that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, they all bring it up, that this is the evidence that says China's not good for Africa because, look, they're bringing in their own workers. As somebody who studies the negotiations, how does this happen? And question number 2 is, does it happen as much as people think it does?
Well, two things. In the negotiation process, yes, that's that's one of the criteria that is discussed. And let's say what I have noticed in a country like Togo, for instance, is that many of the civil servants I've been talking to would tell me, well, China comes with this turnkey project. It's very difficult to negotiate. They come with, their own workers. Because in some cases, the workers, in some cases, there are more African workers, but they are the less skilled workers. But at the higher level, the engineers, the high-skilled workers are from China. Well, the problem there is that the technology transfer does not necessarily occur between these two layers. And that is something that some governments or some ministries negotiate also better than others. Giving you the example of IT project, IT and internet cables and all. When you look at some projects, whether it's in Benin or in Senegal or in Ivory Coast, some of the governments, what they do first is that they get experts. That goes back to my second condition about empowering the negotiators. They bring along experts from these countries or experts who work in these policy banks in order to, get also some additional expertise, but also internal regulatory agencies who are able to go deeper into the different details. One thing that is very important is that civil servants are not necessarily negotiators. Negotiation is a skill. It's an expertise. So it's important to keep that in mind. And that's also a problem because at the negotiation table, on one hand or on one side of the negotiation table, you have civil servants negotiating these deals, sometimes experts or sometimes they are just no expert. But on the Chinese side of the negotiation skills, you have this combination of both, let's say government, but also business interests. The state-owned enterprises, they represent the business, the embassy and the Chinese economic mission, they represent political and also geopolitical interest. And this already creates an issue at the negotiation table, where it's not the same people talking one to another, and criteria like workers are also negotiated at that table. And what should be better negotiated there is, technology transfer among these different workers, skilled workers, less skilled workers, but also hiring much more workers from the government, especially at the high level, at the high skilled workers level.
How you mentioned these four strategies to strengthen Africa's position in negotiating with China. How optimistic are you that African governments are going to take on a more kind of proactive negotiating position? Do you think that they're kind of slowly moving in that direction, or are they still stuck in this idea of like, oh, we better take what they give, or otherwise there won't be anything?
No. On the contrary, well, I've started this research project 4 years ago, and I've noticed several shifts, both in democratic and autocratic governments. It's that the criticism towards China has been growing, especially among civil society organizations and different parts of the population, and so they've been slowly taking those into account. So things that are being, let's say, put on the table more frequently now, are elements related to, as I said earlier, technology transfer. Very important. The Minister of Foreign Affairs from Togo mentioned it very often in his different interactions with the Chinese ambassador, but also all the different governments at the higher level, at the multilateral level, making China become more aware of what they need beyond just hard infrastructure. No, it's important to have all these skills to be able to respond to the different criticism that are addressed by the different population. And that brings me, to this third condition, where it's important for the African governments to integrate the civil society's concerns. Now, overall, there's a positive public perception of Africans towards China, but there's also a growing negative perception that is due to poor quality of Chinese project, and also that the Chinese presence in Africa results in jobs being taken away from locals, and suspicion of corruption of African elites. And so those are more and more, taken into account. Something I wanted to highlight is that sometimes it's within the government that many civil servants, bureaucrats, and also technical experts, they would just try to change things from within. These are the guys that are often negotiating or working on these projects in the shadows. And they are the ones who are trying to reform the process and to come up with a coherent African strategy towards China.
So we started the program talking about predatory lending. And I've got about 16 more questions, but we just can't do a 4-hour podcast because nobody will listen, which is unfortunate. So I want to end our program on predatory lending, because I'm a little bit confused listening to your comments to understand where you come down on all this. The predatory lending narrative implies that the Chinese are out negotiating and imposing themselves on their African counterparts. And yet what you're saying is that there's a very, very complex dance that's happening, that at least what I'm interpreting from what you're saying is that this is not predatory. And this is actually being negotiated from two different sides, and they're coming out with a deal. The deal may not be very good. African agency works both ways. It allows you to succeed, but it also allows you to mess up. Both are agency, right? And so what I'm taking from you is there's an enormous amount of incompetence, corruption, dysfunction, lack of organization, lack of sophistication that all play to the Chinese advantage. So it gives the appearance of predatory nature that the Chinese are winning. But in fact, the difficulties that you're trying to address on the African negotiating side may just be serving up bad deals to the Chinese or good deals for the Chinese. I'm trying to understand this. I'm not trying to bias myself towards the Chinese, but I'm trying to understand, where does the predatory lending part of all this fit in this negotiation discussion? And how do you see it?
Well, it depends on what you mean by predatory lending, right? I think you've talked about African agency. I think African agency is happening at various levels of the negotiation process. And it happens also, not only from the government, but also from civil society organization and multiple different actors, grassroots association, but also communities of China, Africa, friendship. There are so many actors that you don't see in this negotiation process. They don't just happen between government officials. In terms of predatory lending, I think there's a progressive, consciousness, and that happened lately at the FOCAC meeting, where you could see how different African governments have asked China, to move beyond loans and to come and invest in Africa. Creating jobs in African countries also goes through investment, right? And not just creating what people have called a debt trap, for these governments. If I had to give, answer, and let's say a general conclusion, to this, I would say it's important to renew the arguments. It's important to move beyond the good China, bad China, good Africa, bad Africa discussions, and to look very deeply at what level improvement can be made. And that was the purpose of this article, to say, well, behind these big deals, there are so many different dysfunctionalities that happen on both sides. I've targeted the African side because that's the purpose of my research, but also on the Chinese side, there are so many different dysfunctionalities that should be addressed in order for especially African governments, to get better deals.
Dysfunction all around. I like that. Dysfunction all around. How to negotiate how to negotiate infrastructure deals with China. 4 things African governments need to get right. It was written by Folashadé Soulé, who is a senior research associate at the University of Oxford at the Global Economic Governance program there. Folashadé, thank you so much for joining us. This was so fascinating. We went on longer than we normally do, but I just feel that people need to understand the behind-the-scenes operation, because it really warps the simplistic, oftentimes just very, very base headlines that we see. And so understanding the research that you're doing is critical to particularly places like Zambia and Kenya, where this is front and center as issues that are facing Edgar Lungu, the president there, and President Kenyatta as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. If people want to follow you and what you're reading and writing these days, I know you're on Twitter. Can you share your Twitter handle with everybody?
Yes, it's Fola Soulé.
How do you spell that?
It's Folassoule.
And I highly recommend that you follow her. Her article can be found on The Conversation, but if you just type in how to negotiate infrastructure deals with China, it was on Quartz. It was reprinted everywhere, and it really got a lot of headlines, and it got a lot of people thinking about this very important topic. And we're so glad, Folashadé, that we were able to have you join us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Cobus.
Cobus. This is one of those discussions that I really wanted to go on for so much longer. I had so many questions to ask her because really, if you unravel these negotiations, you in some ways unravel the mystery of China-Africa relations today. I mean, it's all there. And again, I feel frustrated in one sense that we hear more on the African side and we don't hear much on the Chinese side. I've reached out, just so you know, I've reached out to 3 Chinese scholars this week. All of them ignored me. And you just can't get people to speak publicly on these issues. And they would never talk about things that happen in the negotiations because of the concern that they have given the current political climate. And it's really unfortunate because we need to hear from both sides. When she said at the end there's dysfunction on the Chinese side, there is dysfunction. What I kept thinking about when she was talking is never assign conspiracy when mediocrity will do. That's the saying that I live by. And I just feel that when you hear people who are actually at the table, whether it was the former Liberian Public Works Minister Judy Moore, who we interviewed, who's now at the Center for Global Development in Washington, who gave us a much more complex, nuanced picture of China-Africa infrastructure negotiations, or listening to Folashadé. Once again, it is much more complicated, and the simplistic narratives that people like John Bolton put forward fall apart very, very quickly. I think the predatory lending narrative does come under assault. I don't know yet if it's in fact true, but I do think it's challenged when you hear it from people like Folashadé.
I 100% agree. And Folashadé's work also shows how important it is to look at African governments with a lot more of an analytical eye, to not just lump them all together and to not just assume what their internal dynamics are like, but to actually look at the specific, dynamics that actually undermine these negotiations frequently, and to actually look at the political realities within African governments, which are frequently completely ignored in this discussion. Africa is kind of flattened and lumped together as one thing, whereas Africa is lots and lots of things, lots of people, lots of actors, and you need to unpack these complex relationships to see how the negotiations actually happen.
And remember, even at the country level, there's a lot of diversity. She talked about how one deal worked very well, and then another ministry handles another deal, and it's full with corruption. So forget Africa. When we get to countries as large as Nigeria or Kenya, there's a lot of moving parts here, and the Chinese, oftentimes, they too are separate entities and actors. And I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of people make about the Chinese is that there's this misperception that the Chinese are this monolithic, centralized, highly organized communist entity that comes in, like a fine oiled machine. Anybody who's lived in China knows that's not the case. But for outsiders, they oftentimes have that perception. They too are chaotic in many respects. One hand doesn't always know what the other is doing. So this is by no means, this is the end of this discussion for us. We're going to continue it throughout the year, and we hopefully can get people on the Chinese side. I'm trying very, very, very hard. If anybody has some recommendations on Chinese scholars who are interested and able and open to speak with the media, or other scholars, Western scholars or international scholars who are interfacing with Chinese experts on this, we would love to get the Chinese side so that we're not speculating and guessing, but we're actually hearing from people who know firsthand what's going on. So that'll do it for this edition. Before we go, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to give a really warm and generous thank you to Seth Harris, a recent graduate from Carleton College in Minnesota in the United States, who came by to see me, and we had lunch together, and it was fantastic to speak with him. So Seth, excellent to meet you, and really, really excited for what you've got going ahead. And he gave lots of nice feedback on the program. So we always love to hear from you. If you want to email us, you can hit us up on Twitter, on LinkedIn. My email is on the, everywhere here. We're still trying to fix Cobus's email. That's my plan for 2019 is to get Cobus a China-Africa Project email address. We've got everything else going, but we haven't been able to get that to work. So that we'll do that. Also, I bought my son for Christmas. I'm not going to actually say the word. It's an Amazon Dot. I won't actually say the word that triggers it because then people will hate me for it. But I tried, I said, play the China-Africa Project podcast, and basta, there it was. It started playing.
Wow.
So if you've got one of those
wonderful.
devices, which I will not say her name, but if you've got one of those devices, you can play us directly through that via TuneIn. So that's pretty exciting. So train your Alexa to play the China and Africa podcast. We really appreciate it. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.